really want to say, especially the students out there, if you decided to do this thing, congratulations to you. You know, they always talk about the world goes round because people show up, and your willingness to participate in this program means you're helping the world go round by showing up. So good for you. You're brave. I'm having a little trouble with my video here. I guess I've never done this before, so I'm going to keep, I guess, freezing up here a little bit. But I'll keep talking and try to make this as smooth as I can. Like Monica was saying, I've done this now for many years. I fell in love with the program about a decade ago, I think it was. It just makes me so proud to be a judge and watch young people treat poetry so seriously and with such care. So it's a real thrill to see you guys really working at this, and I really wish you all the best of luck.
Lowell, before you start any reading or anything, could I just ask you, I didn't think to ask you this before, but when did you begin doing poetry yourself?
Well, some of the young people out there, I think you will identify with this. I think I always was doing poetry. I didn't know it. You know, I think just like any artist, like visual artists are probably always in love with, you know, the visual things around them. I was always in love with words and noise and sound. And so I tell the story that when I was real small, my oldest brother went to school first, and he came back with books and he could read. And I was insanely jealous about that. So I'd steal his books and I'd take them in the closet, and I'd take a flashlight and a notepad and I'd copy all those words I couldn't even read, but I'd get them down there because I wanted them myself, you know. And I think that's just a sort of sign. And some of you that, you know, do things like you keep journals at home, even if they're private journals or something, but you write stuff down. You just got the urge to write stuff down, or you like to listen to language. That's all a sign, I think, of you know, you're the right person here at the right time. So
yeah, thank you. So did you have some poems you were going to share today, Lowell?
Well, let me start with this.
Okay.
I made a few notes here thinking about what might be important for potential participants here.
Mm-hmm.
And the first is, I think, just to say that you know, this is a kind of different situation for poetry. Oftentimes, you know, people just sit at home and read the poem on the page, or else if you go to a standard poetry reading, it's just somebody standing up there reading to you. Poetry out loud is a sort of combination of the auditory and the visual. I don't think it should be confused with, you know, the new slam poetry or performance poetry. It's a little different than that too. It's a lighter combination, I think, than on the visual and the dramatics than would be performance poetry. So, but having said that, so you got a kind of double job. You've got to get the language across, and you also have to present visually on the stage. And so those are the concerns I'm kind of hoping to talk about a little bit now. But I also wanted to invite you to email me if you want. If you have a particular poem or something you're working on, I'd also be glad to take a look at that poem. And when you hear what I've got to say here, maybe I could also do some coaching individually that way. And so my email address, I'm pretty sure, is available on the Montana Arts Council site.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not, I'm sure Monica will get it there. Yeah, but I'd be glad to do that too. So I want to start with, I'll give you a poem here. And this is a poem that I've memorized for Poetry Out Loud. And I'll read it for you, and then I'll go back and I'll try to explain to you in some ways how I prepared for that. You won't be able to see me very well. If you can see me at all, it'll just be my head because I keep popping in and out here on the screen. But I know you can hear me. So do your best to listen to the poem as I read it. And then I'll go back and I'll explain a little bit about how I decided to read that. And that might help you in interpreting your own poem. Does that help, you think, Monica?
I think that's terrific. Thank you, Lowell.
Okay,
Yeah.
so here comes a poem. It's called Names of Horses by Donald Hall. All winter your brute shoulders strained against collars, padding and steer hide over the ash hames to haul sledges of cordwood for drying through spring and summer, for the Glenwood stove next winter, and for the simmering range. In April, you pulled cartloads of manure to spread on the fields, dark manure of Holsteins and knobs of your own clustered with oats. All summer, you mowed the grass in meadow and hayfield, the mowing machine clacketing beside you while the sun walked high in the morning. An afternoon's heat, you pulled a clawed rake through the same acres, gathering stacks, and dragged the wagon from stack to stack and built the hay rack back uphill to the chafy barn, 3 loads of hay a day from standing grass in the morning. Sundays, you trotted the 2 miles to church with the light load of a leather quarter-top buggy and grazed in the sound of hymns. Generation on generation, your neck rubbed the windowsill of the stall, smoothing the wood as the sea smooths glass. When you were old and lame, when your shoulders hurt bending to graze, one October, the man who fed you and kept you and harnessed you every morning led you through corn stubble to sandy ground above Eagle Pond and dug a hole beside you where you stood shuddering in your skin and laid the shotgun's muzzle in the boneless hollow behind your ear and fired a slug into your brain, felled you into your grave, shoveling sand to cover you, setting goldenrod upright above you, where by next summer a dent in the ground made your monument. For 150 years, in the pasture of dead horses, roots of pine trees pushed through the pale curves of your ribs. Yellow blossoms flourished above you in autumn, and in winter, frost heaved your bones in the ground. Old toilers, soil makers, oh Roger, Mackerel, Riley, Ned, Nellie, Chester, Lady Ghost. So when I first, this poem is a favorite of mine, and I think that's an important thing. Find something you really identify with that you want to present, something that strikes you in a kind of heartfelt way. And this poem always really gets to me. And I think what I really like about it is it's kind of a circular poem. It talks about, the way life goes on, even though everything dies. So it's kind of a Hakuna Matata, the old Lion King thing. And I noticed when I read through it that it's a cycle of things. He talks about all winter, and then he talks about in the spring, and then in the summer, and then in the fall. And he does this repeatedly, that he repeats that kind of cycle of seasons. And so when I come across that in the poem, I really want to emphasize that. It starts out all winter, and the next stanza starts out in April, right? And the next stanza, afternoons, heat, and the next stanza, Sundays. So each of those things are clue then for the audience, to kind of keep following along. The poet's giving us this sequence of time, and I really want to emphasize those then when I stand up to recite this. So that's kind of the first thing is, look for those cues that the audience might need to follow along. But then I want to ask myself too, every poem has a speaker. So I'm asking myself, who's the speaker of this poem? Well, it's not necessarily the poet himself. It's sometimes a poet's job to take on what we call a persona, to become the voice of someone else. And that means, you can be a male and you can be reading a poem in the voice of a female or vice versa. And, or someone of another race or someone from across the world. But your job then as the interpreter of this poem is to look at the poem and say, well, who's speaking here? And in this case, in the poem Names of Horses, I hear it's probably an older man, and he's had some experience on the farm for a long time, and he's really in a complex emotional state. He's feeling many things at once. He's feeling nostalgic and happy for having known these horses. And at the same time, he's feeling some sadness for having lost them. So that in a good poem, and in the poems that you have been given to select from, you'll find a lot of emotional complexity. So you might really look at the poem then, after you find the clues time-wise for directions, how to keep the audience involved. Then look at what are the emotions? What's the speaker feeling? What emotions are trying to be conveyed here? But don't assume that it's a singular emotion. I think sometimes in watching students recite, that's one of the problems I've seen is they feel like maybe a poem is a happy poem, so they're happy throughout it. Very seldom is that the case. Most often a poem will modulate in its emotions, and so it might go through a whole series of things. I feel this poem does that. And by the time it gets to that stanza where it says, when you were old and lame, when your shoulders hurt bending to grace, well, that's a pretty sad moment. And then when he lays a shotgun muzzle in the boneless hollow behind your ear, now we've got real suspense and sort of, a dark, you can hear the dark music playing in the background. And then all of a sudden in the end, that last stanza, for 150 years in the pasture of dead horses, now you can hear the music kind of crescendo, and if this were a movie again, there's a kind of triumph to that last stanza that says, even though these horses have suffered and worked hard and come and gone, their spirit is still here. And so you really want to sort of follow that emotional chain, and you want to reproduce that in your voice then for the audience. And that's something, again, that's really worth practicing. Think about how that poem moves emotionally. And then another thing, when I read this poem, when I recited this poem for you, one of the things also that I look for are key images. I'm sure you understand the word images from your English classes, etc. Is words are used to make pictures in the reader's or the listener's mind. And so anything you can do when you come across an image to really highlight that image is important. So for instance, in this poem, when I come to, I always get chuckles from grade school kids when I read that line, says, you pulled cartloads of manure to spread on the fields, dark manure of Holsteins and knobs of your own clustered with oats. Well, that's kind of, not an image maybe you want to hold at breakfast, but it's a very interesting and important rural image, isn't it? So when we're talking about horses, like lots of people associate those sorts of sensory cues, that kind of those smells, with horsiness. And so when I get to that line about cartloads of manure, I really want to slow down, and I really want to kind of emphasize that to the audience and not just go over it real quickly. You may have in mind when you're reciting it exactly what the poem is saying, and you may have in your head those images, but you got to go really slow, I think, to let the audience absorb those images too. So that's a kind of next point.
Well, thank you for all of that. Can I just interrupt momentarily?
Sure. Yeah.
I think we have Norma and maybe Risa on the webinar, and I don't know if the two of you saw my note on the chat box, but if you could unmute your microphone, at least at the point where you'd like to say something. You don't have to leave it unmuted the whole time, but I think later on in this session, Lowell and I would love to have some conversation with you. So that's the bottom left of your screen. If you just hover your mouse over the screen, you'll see that. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there so that everyone was on the same page. So sorry about the interruption. Lowell, go ahead.
No, that's okay. And so if our guests can also speak, feel free to just speak up. I'd love to. I feel a little lonely here just talking to the screen. So if we can get a conversation going, that would really even be more comfortable for me, and I'd love to meet you. So speak up if you will, please. So let me give you another poem, though, and then just, I think a second example might be worthwhile. This is a little shorter poem, and it's one I love to do in public because, again, I think it's very visual, and I think it's complex enough to be interesting for people to listen to. And this is a poem called One Morning Shoeing Horses, and it's by a man whose name all of a sudden I forgot, Henry Taylor. Henry Taylor. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner in the 1970s. So this is One Morning Shoeing Horses. I hold a shank while the blacksmith nails a shoe in place. And think about how many years I've worked at this, watching the horse's ears for signs of what he might decide to do, touching his neck, turning his head to coax a little weight away from the lifted hoof, the fly whisk light and always on the move, the soothing whispers tuned to hammer strokes. But I've been unsteady at it since a day like this, some 10 years back, when a driven nail got under the blacksmith's wedding ring, unclinched. There was a kind of roaring scream. The horse flinched and snatched his hoof, and there the finger lay, twitching a little beside the water pail. So that's always a favorite poem of mine to recite. Hey, Sean.
Hi, Sean.
That's always
not quite there yet.
That's always a favorite poem of mine to recite. So here, let me just go through the process again. Why did I choose it? I chose it because it really strikes me. It sort of gets to the heart of who I am and some of my interests, and I really associate with that poem. So I think that's a good first thing in making your choices. Find one you really kind of click with. And then second of all, it's really important that in this poem, I really need to deliver that title, One Morning Shoeing Horses. So I want to be really kind of purposeful in front of an audience in pronouncing that, because that clues the audience into kind of an auditory channel of what's going to happen. So I would really want to just stand before the audience, pause a moment, and then say very clearly and slowing, One Morning Shoeing Horses. And I would want to do better than I did. I'd remember the author's name by Henry Taylor, okay? And then make sure that, again, speak loudly and slowly. The audience needs a little more time to absorb some of the words and the images than you do because you're familiar with the poem already. So back off a little bit, be slow and purposeful with your language. Make sure you're pronouncing each word like you're tasting it, like you're savoring it. So in this poem, then, it begins with, I hold a shank while the blacksmith nails a shoe. And that's a really important image. I want the audience to see that right from the beginning, that as a one morning shoeing horses, I'm working with the blacksmith now. I'm holding this horse's shank, the shank of his leg, while the blacksmith nails a shoe in place. And if you look at this poem, you can go online and find it, I'm sure, One Morning Shoeing Horses by Henry Taylor. It's a rhyming poem, but you didn't hear the rhyme, did you? And instead, what you heard was more of a kind of spoken conversational tone. So let me just give you that first stanza again, then I'll point out the rhymes. So the first stanza goes, I hold a shank while the blacksmith nails a shoe in place. And think about how many years I've worked at this, watching the horse's ears for signs of what he might decide to do, touching his neck, turning his head to coax a little weight away from the lifted hoof, the fly whisk light and always on the move, the soothing whispers tuned to hammer strokes. So there's rhyming words there. I hold the shank while the blacksmith nails a shoe in place. And think about how many years I've worked at this, watching the horse's ears for signs of what he might decide to do. So you see those rhyming words, but the poem itself doesn't want you to emphasize those rhyming words. Notice how I spoke right through those rhyming words to make the poem sound more conversational. That's a kind of contemporary poetic technique. So we don't recite the poem so the rhymes are very obvious. We don't hammer much emphasis on those lines, on the words that rhyme, but we just try to make it sound as conversational and as much like real language in conversation as possible. So I had to ask myself in this poem too then, who's the speaker? Well, it's this guy helping this blacksmith. It's not the blacksmith, it's probably the horse's owner, and he's out there helping, but he's nervous, right? How does he feel? He's nervous. He even says, but I've been unsteady at it since a day like this. And you can kind of hear, if that was a Stephen King movie or something, you can kind of hear in that moment a little suspense building, right? But I've been unsteady at it since a day like this. And of course, then the listener or the viewer is thinking, well, what sort of day are we going to be talking about? And in this case, we're talking about this accident that's going to happen, right? When a driven nail got under the blacksmith's wedding ring unclinched. Okay. And then, of course, there's that final line. And I really want to give it a pause before then to make sure that the audience is ready for it. So, after the horse flinched and snatched his hoof, then I paused, and there the finger lay twitching a little beside the water pail. And that, of course, if you do it right, the audience all goes, "Oh, that's an awful thing to think about." But we love that kind of suspense and thrill in some ways too, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
So those are two poems, and that I hope I've given you some help with that way. Monica, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think those are two excellent examples, and the ideas about presenting the words, that's super meaningful, I think. The savoring of the words and all of that, I'm sure everyone appreciated that. I was wondering if you had anything to say about sort of the other extreme, which would be the tendency that some people may lean toward of maybe overacting as opposed to recitation, and what the difference is.
I think that's a really good a good thing to think about. And I think
it's a fine line.
What's that?
The fine line.
Yeah, it's a very fine line, and this is where it's not slam poetry. It's not exactly performance poetry, and it's not exactly the old typical straight poetry reading either. It's a kind of hybrid of all those things. And I really think one of the best things, I was talking to Monica before we started recording, that you can do for yourself is go to that Poets Out Loud website and look at some of the videos of some of the finalists presenting, because I think they walk that fine line very well. One of the finalists is a guy named Josh Kelly, and he's actually from the Flathead Valley, and he got to the national, the finals, and I think he placed like third or something, so he came really close. And he recites a poem called Dulce et Decorum Est. It's a poem about World War I, and of course he's a high school kid, so he wasn't in World War I, but he does just a fabulous job of making that poem meaningful for an audience who maybe, like himself, had never been in war and things like that. And so that's a good idea, I think, is to watch some of these other finalists present. But I just wanted to say, so you got, like I said in the beginning, you've got two things to worry about. You got the auditory aspect of your voice, and then you got the visual aspect of your gestures and your body and your facial expressions. And I think that's hard. That's challenging. I as a judge for many years, I think I was distracted when people's gestures became overly self-conscious. I liked more, I think, and I was more persuaded by it when they were just the suggestion of gestures. So I think you can see my face right now. In the one poem about names of horses, there's a line that goes, smoothing the wood. He rubbed his neck on the windowsill, smoothing the wood as the sea smooths glass. And when I read that in public, I oftentimes just sort of make a little neck gesture. Here I am again. Let me get me back. A little neck gesture, without going really hugely or something, which would be distracting, but just a little bit of movement that shows, that I'm in tune with what the poem is trying to say too.
Okay.
So if anything, I would be quiet with my gestures, but I would let them be there too. Sometimes it's just a hand opening or closing. Sometimes it's the raise of an eyebrow. And you might just, that's the good thing about lots of rehearsal, is getting, doing it in front of people and getting their comments. But yeah, I think Monica's got a good point. Don't over dramatize, and don't even don't over dramatize with your language. notice where even in that poem I read about the one morning shoeing horses, where it says, and there the finger lay twitching a little beside the water pail. I don't go, oh my God, and there the finger lay twitching beside the water pail. You don't want to do that. That would spoil it. That would be, then the poem becomes all about you. And you don't want the poem to be about you. You want the poem to speak for itself. That's your job. Make the poem speak for itself. Help the audience hear the poem speaking. So good luck with that. That's hard. I struggle with that every day.
That's excellent, Lowell. You've already somewhat covered sort of the emphasis and the rhythm of choosing words to emphasize, but specifically in terms of volume control, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, yeah.
Because that's another extreme I've seen a little bit.
I wonder, Monica, actually, maybe this is the time to mention it, but
Sure.
I wonder if it'd be useful before the whole event begins that people who want get a chance to go up to the microphone and just feel what it's like to be near that microphone and to hear their voice at different distances from that microphone, because it's a real surprise otherwise first to get up there, and that microphone's kind of intimidating.
Yes.
And you don't know if others are hearing you like you're hearing yourself.
That's right. That's a great suggestion, Lowell. I think we'll plan to work that in. And Sean, do you do that at your regional? Oh, you're muted. Sorry. Can you unmute on the bottom left?
And sorry, I'm in and out because I'm working. But
oh yeah.
What was the question?
I was just wondering if you did a sound check with students at your regional.
Definitely. In fact, I put all the students in one area.
Yeah. I think the reason that we haven't done
program, and then I have them come up one at a time and just say the title and then their name.
And that may be one reason why we haven't done it at state, because most of the students have done that at regional, but of course it's a different microphone and all that. And so we'll definitely build in time so that when students first arrive, they'll have a chance to do that without people around.
They do it at nationals too. They do a mic check and everything.
I don't actually remember if we did that at state last year, and maybe I just wasn't on hand when that was happening, but we absolutely should do that. It's really important for anybody in any situation like this, performance or not. So that's a great suggestion, Lowell. Thank you. Thanks for chiming in, Sean. Nice to see you.
Yeah,
good to see you, Sean.
Hi. How's it going? I caught a little bit. I'm glad it's recorded.
Yeah, we did this knowing full well that maybe only a handful of people would be able to jump in and out throughout this hour. And this is all an experiment, but we will have another one with Mark Gibbons coming up. So I'll be sending information out on that, and we'll see what the feedback is. But we're really happy to have Lowell leading this first one today. Doing a great job, Lowell. Thank you.
I was wondering so both of those two poems that I gave are kind of similar in that they're kind of suspense and serious suspense poems. And I'm wondering, I've got a poem of my own that is just a poem about celebrating the world around us. And I thought, there are poems in the packet of possible poems for our students to be performing that have a different tone than what I've read already. And I wonder if I might do this poem yet too.
Oh, please. Yes.
Yep. Okay, so this is a poem of my own. That's kind of cheating because, you fall in love with your own poems, at least for a while. But this is a poem that celebrates. And you could tell, again, look at the title of the poem. The titles are usually very important. And the title of this poem is called Wondrous World. Wondrous World. Okay, and so right away I know, as a reader, and if I were to present that title to an audience, it speaks a little bit already to what the poem's going to be all about, and it sets the audience then on the sort of right channel to be ready to hear the rest of the poem. But it says wondrous, so I want, in my own voice and in my own sort of body language on stage there, I'd want to sort of set the audience up for that wondrous feeling, the feeling of wonder and appreciation of the world around you. So here's the poem, Wondrous World. Many wonders I've beheld in this wondrous world of canyons and chasms and summits of sculpted snow. None so radiant, so indelible as my daughter, 9 years old, perched on a granite ledge, dangling her legs awash in sunshine above a slope of scree, slanting into an alpine meadow of riotous and frantic blooms. I'd left her there while I scouted our most favorable path of descent and navigated to her side again by the music of her song, a child's song she'd learned for the pageant at school. Her bird-like voice in the breeze amidst the incense of nectar, her smile and rejoicing wave upon my return. A dozen mountain goats, curious, nosing closer, transfixed to witness this ever-unfolding wondrous world, where I, like the goats, paused in reverence. And like the goats, I inched forward toward her, while clouds above continued to flow and blossoms widened to the sky's melodious allure. And beneath us, ancient strata rose toward daylight through dark. So I wanted to bring this poem yet out because I think it's so different than the other two. The other two bring to the audience a whole different sort of set of emotions. This one is another kind of web of emotions, I think. And in reading this for you, I wanted to show you too, it's 3 stanzas and then a line that sits all by itself. And so those stanza breaks, I think, are very important. So when I came to that line that ended, the stanza that ended with a meadow of riotous and frantic blooms, then I paused because that's the setup, that's the introduction. And here comes the second stanza then. I'd left her there while I scouted our most favorable path of descent. Now I'm going from the setup to the story, see? And so that I think the audience needs a little bit of break there, a little pause. Mm-hmm. And then that second stanza ends with the dozen mountain goats. Well, there were no mountain goats there at all until the last 4 words of the second stanza. So I want to make sure I really emphasize that so the audience is aware that, oh, here come the mountain goats, right? So at the end of that stanza, the lines are, her smile and rejoicing wave upon my return. And then I very much want to emphasize a dozen mountain goats, right? A dozen mountain goats. Then comes the next stanza, the final stanza. Curious, nosing closer. All of this then talking about the mountain goats and I sharing this wondrous moment, witnessing this young girl in this beautiful wild scenery, just reacting so like she's part of it, like she's part of the world, the wondrous world around her, capturing, I hope, what a little kid does, a young child does, when they walk out in the world innocently in love with it all. It makes older people like me love it again too. So anything I think you can do, and I hope in this poem, especially because it's about wonder, I really wanted to go pretty slow. I really wanted to slow down and really make sure that any of the images there, or especially the most important cues, like the cue of as my daughter, 9 years old, perched on a granite ledge, dangling her legs. Those are really important because that's really central to the poem. The audience really needs to see that before they can sort of feel the rest of it. So I hope that helps.
That's fantastic, Lowell. Thank you so much for sharing that third poem. We have a question, and I don't know if you can see it or if I should read it to you, but
go ahead and read it.
Group chat.
Go ahead and read it.
Okay. It's from Norma, and she says, what about when students choose emotional pieces, love, death, etc.? How should they show strong emotion?
I would be very careful not to over dramatize. I mean, again, just as a judge, really let the language speak for itself. So the emotion should be in the language. your gestures and voice intonation and stuff should augment those words in the poem, but don't override them. Let the poem speak for itself. So if, again, look at Josh Kelly's performance of Dulce Decorum Est, because it's very high emotion. And he does, he skirts that fine line of maybe going too far, but I don't think he goes over it. And I think that's how he managed to get as far in the finals as he did. But it's a great question. That's a very central issue in all this stuff.
And Norma has another one, but thank you for that example of a video for them to look up, because that is a beautiful example of a student work. I've seen that
Josh
one.
is a PhD. Really? Josh is a PhD candidate now at University of Wisconsin in theater.
Wow, that's so great. Well, Norma's follow-up question is, how much should students think about their audience, older people like me, and that sort of thing? Like, how much do you think that they need to be thinking about that and act accordingly?
You guys are asking really good questions, because that's something I grapple with, and I'm sure Sean and other poets do too, all the time, is, you know, you want to sort of treat the audience respectfully. That is, you know, they're just as smart as you are. We're all pretty much in the same leaky boat that way, right? We all have the same, pretty much the same intelligence and pretty much the same things that get in our way of being smart. So think of the audience. They honor them respectfully by not in some way condescending or speaking down to them, but at the same time recognize they may need some help. So speaking slowly, speaking audibly, cueing them in on some of these critical moments in the poem and things like that is really important. But the audience, you know, it's like when you're writing the poem, the audience is critical. You've got to, like a good movie, you got to first of all capture their attention, then you got to draw them in, then you got to hold them, and then you got to pay them off before you're done. So all of that is critical to the performance, and it's critical to the, you know, person, the poet who wrote the poem. Those things should be built in there. You got to kind of look for those cues, like, and I just mentioned the movie thing. I'm always big on talking about that because movies are so alive in our culture, and the really best of the movies demonstrate for us a good way. How do you tell a story? Well, you know, when you're watching a really good movie, the people who put that together know how to tell a story. And a lot of poems do the same things. Now, the story in poems are not exactly, you know, chronological narratives oftentimes, but they're little scenes in some ways. The camera just comes on, and you have this scene, and you want the full emotional richness of that scene. And so we hope that's there in the language. But the question then about how much to think about the audience there and how much emotion to portray, let the audience kind of feel those things for themselves too, rather than just watching you feel it. So I would be gentle with the gestures and the motions. Just suggest them more so than do them.
That's fantastic, Lowell. I don't know if you have planned to share anything else, but I wanted to give Sean a chance to ask a question or to bring up something she might be thinking about too.
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts as you were speaking, Lowell. And one is that you can't avoid honoring the audience if you're serving the poem.
Yes.
If you do your homework, if you really pay attention to these aspects of it that you're pointing out, you'll stay in the poem and you'll bring it.
I think that's great.
So I think that your point about the audience being so smart, you know, that's well taken too. And you really can't talk down to them or lecture them. And you avoid all those pitfalls if you stay in the poem. Another thought I had when you were reading your poem was that it's great to listen to poets read the poem that you select. Because even though you may make your own choices with enjambment, as you did with making those lines that were set apart stand on their own, there was a point there that those 12, the dozen mountain goats, and then the next line could be enjammed with good effect too. But you get a lot of information hearing the poet read how they wrote it and how they want to bring that across. Then you can make a very good educated choice on your part of how you want to bring that poem. Because on the page, you get different information that you do from a recitation. And then it's the person reciting, it's their obligation to make those good choices according to how they want to live in that poem too. The poet has given us their work. We have to honor it. We have to add ourselves. And then, you know, the total effect, I think, is what the judges see during the competition. So those were just a couple thoughts.
Those are good thoughts. I'm glad we're recording this because I need to write those down. But I think it's very well said. Very well said.
Yeah, thank you, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Norma doesn't have her microphone on, but Sean, did you have other questions or anything that you're wanting Lowell to address on behalf of students? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just want to make sure.
I'm just trying to think. Not really. Not at this point.
Yeah. Well, we'll have other chances in our other webinars, you know, over the next month, and hopefully we can get students to sit on some of these and ask questions in real time. That's a goal. You know, it's very hard to schedule one of these no matter what time of day we choose. You know, there's always going to be something. It was suggested to me by someone who was actually not on the webinar today that maybe the 11:30 to 12:30, you know, might capture some students. And so, you know, a little slow start this time, but maybe the next time we'll have more participants. And, you know, it'd be great to have some student questions in real time. As well, but you know, again, the point of doing this was to connect all of us in some way. Real time is best, but at least via recording. I didn't want the students to have only feedback from the national level at this point. I think it's really great to understand who some of the players are in Montana and some of the other schools, and just try to create a little community, particularly for the outlying schools and any students who are new to Poetry Out Loud. In particular, I wanted to offer something from them, for them, sorry. Yeah, so just a little background on my thinking on this, but feel free to give me your feedback about how you think this might work best going forward. So, yeah.
Well, now you got my, Sean has got my thinking going here.
Good.
But one other thing I just wanted to mention was when you're getting ready to do this recitation, to really, you know, bring it to as many people as possible, but especially look for someone who will be honest with you and who will give you, you know, the best advice. Some people's advice are better than others, and then be very open-minded to hearing that criticism. You know, sometimes criticism hurts a little bit, you know, like they might even talk about you're standing funny or something. And I see myself on screen right here and I just cringe, you know what I mean?
You look
but I think that's very helpful, you know, when we learn how to accept criticism from other people. Criticism can be praise, and it can be, you know, the positive or the negative things that they're telling us. But I think it's really important to listen and then, you know, select for yourself what you think is useful feedback and incorporate that then to make it the best possible presentation. Sometimes how you think you're doing it, how you think you look, is not how you're coming across. So information from other people is very useful.
I think your point about that, Lowell, is really excellent. To have students practice in front of different audiences, you know, not only maybe their peers, as might happen in after-school practice times and so on. So thank you for saying that. I don't know if there are other questions or other things that you would want to share, but we're nearing the end of our webinar time. Anybody? Making sure that Norma has gotten her questions answered. You know, initially I thought we would just ask various poets to do recordings of some feedback for students, but I wanted to try this model just to allow for some conversation. So again, hopefully going forward, I think maybe we'll get some more participants as the word's out and whatnot. So Lowell, is that it for you?
I think that's pretty much.
Okay.
Again, I'd like to invite anybody, if you want, to email me, and I'd be glad to sort of, you know, I can even over the phone or something, and you know, I'd be glad to provide some feedback too. So don't be afraid to holler at me.
Great. A new POL weekly will go out tomorrow, and I will include your contact information, Lowell, as well as the link to this recorded session. There are a couple steps I have to do. It may take me up to 24 hours, but more than likely it'll happen sooner, and then we can include that in tomorrow's letter. And Norma and Sean, I know I will be in touch with you really soon so that we regional coordinators can work together. But Lowell, thank you so very much for your time today and for sharing yourself with students. As you always do. And just another reminder that Lowell is our Poet Laureate for this 2-year stint, and information about his 101 events poetry project is at art.mt.gov, the Montana Arts Council site. So thank you everybody for joining us.
And thank you all for your work on this. I think it's a great program for the kids and for everyone else too. So I'm always bragging about this program. I think it's
it's a program easy to brag about. The minute you get any experience with it, I don't know anyone that doesn't fall in love with this program. So yeah, I want to reiterate thank you to all of you for what you're doing, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person very soon.
Good.
Yeah.
All right.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.